Hello, welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss. I'm a policy analyst at the Center for American Progress, and with me is my co-host Robert Farley of the University of Kentucky for this year-end edition, biggest foreign policy stories of 2013. It was 2013, right?
Yeah, I think it was 2013. I was going to ask
It was
you.
2013.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, so listen, let's just say it's 2013.
Let's just assume, and if it wasn't, then we can kind of put it up next year.
We don't want anybody to really know about the 2014 until they get rolled out. We've been
Right. No,
embargoed on that.
we pre-recorded all of these years ago.
Right.
Um, So anyway, I think we chatted briefly before about some of the biggest stories, Rob and I in our own areas of interest, but some of those definitely cross over and we agree on. And the first one is the NSA story. The leaks dropped by former security contractor Edward Snowden and reported by, among others, Glenn Greenwald in The Guardian and Bart Gellman in the Washington Post have probably been, as far as the general U.S., the U.S. media discussions about how we conduct national security, about privacy, raising some of these very, very central questions about security. I think there's very little question that was the biggest story of the year. Would you agree, Rob?
I have to agree as well. I mean, especially for a story that doesn't really, it's not quite right to say that the NSA story is death-free, right? Because the NSA, the entire collection of metadata, the entire collection of intelligence that the NSA issue is associated with, of course, plays a role in the ongoing drone campaigns and ongoing special forces campaigns. But I think in terms of sort of bringing about the end of the I mean, I don't know how far we want to go in making this declaration, but it would not surprise me at all if we look back sort of at the Snowden moment as sort of this point at which the expansion of the national security state that followed the September 11th attacks really began to roll back, right? That this was the high tide, and this was sort of its bounce back, rebound moment where the NSA was curtailed. And it's really interesting, I guess, sort of, I mean, the Snowden revelations are, in a lot of ways, more interesting for sort of how people have reacted to them than for the specific information revealed. Like, there have been some important revelations, but also a bunch of stuff that, people who were in the community, people who were in the specialists in the area already knew, but to publicize it to such an extent and to create such an interesting reaction in the United States and elsewhere, I think it's the biggest event of 2013 in foreign policy.
Yeah. No, I think that point about where the lines came down and who thought what, and who was critical and who was kind of like, oh, it's not a huge story. I think this is somewhere where I think Glenn Greenwald has a point, and this is a point that he has made repeatedly, is that a lot of this is determined by where you sit politically.
Right.
I think it's possible to overstate, but I think the point really does stand that if this were a Republican administration, obviously Democrats would be much, much more critical.
Right.
But at the same time, I do think there has been some, Democrats have taken this up. Right. Not on the Hill as much. Speaking in defense of my own organization, the Center for American Progress, we did put out a paper by my colleague Peter Jewell that called for a commission, a reappraisal of these practices. And the administration itself, it created a commission to look at this. People were critical of the makeup of that commission. I think that's to be expected. But it does seem to me that the administration is moving, albeit slowly, to address some of these questions.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, as Glenn has talked about quite a bit, and as you just suggested, it is, politically, it's an extremely complicated, because, had this come out in 2008 with the Bush administration, or had it come out, in 2013 with the Romney administration, something along those lines, the politics would have been completely uncomplicated. Because on the one hand, you would have had Democrats united that this was just a profound invasion of the basic human rights of Americans. You would have had naysayers on the Republican side. I mean, certainly I don't think Rand Paul necessarily would have, he probably would have had roughly the same attitude as he did in real life. But you would have had a much more unified Republican Party, I think, in support of the NSA than what we actually have, which is really two parties divided, ideologically divided as to the importance, as to the perfidy associated with the actions of the NSA.
Well, I mean,
which generates a much more interesting political reality. We should hasten to add.
Well, I think you do. I mean, I haven't. I mean, this goes to the broader way our national security debate is sort of arranged right now. You've got, and it kind of, it more or less shakes down this way with NSA. I mean, my joke, it's not a joke, it's true, about, the way Congress feels about drone strikes is that on the dovish side, you've got people who are totally okay with drones, and on the hawkish side, you've got people who want to then go in and burn the corpses.
Right.
And that's more or less, where the NSA, as I see it, at least on the Hill, breaks down. You people who are like, you'll have people who are critical. You have people like Justin Amash, who, again, I think he's been spot on in a lot of his criticisms. You've got Senator Ron Wyden, but in general, you haven't seen this massive push from either party to address the problems. You've kind of got a slowly simmering amount of criticism, but I think it also reflects the fact that this really hasn't caught fire with the public.
Right. Right. That's interesting. So, do you think that this is? I mean, well, I guess what is our definition of catching fire in these terms? Sort of associated or separated from the Hunger Games issue. But so, yeah, I mean, polling on surveillance and on the NSA is certainly much more negative. But I mean, is the suggestion that even if the polling is quite negative, the salience remains low, and so that nobody's really going to lose their job or win election to Congress based on the NSA issue?
Right. I think it's the same sort of thing that we see with say the Iran question. Is that polling? When you look at all the polls that have been done, I think the American public is fairly supportive, if not strongly supportive, of the deal that was struck in Geneva. But the question is, how much do they care? I mean, who are the ones actually beating down, the members of Congress's doors and doing the lobbying and doing the phone calling and doing the emailing?
Right.
And my perception is there has not yet been a kind of upsurge of, communication from voters to their representatives. That indicates this is a real problem. I hope that will change because I think it is a real problem.
I mean, here's a question. Does it need to be, or is this a situation in which sort of elite opinion, the shifting of elite opinion, and we can argue about how much it's shifted, but sort of elites just sort of, maybe the term I'm looking for it is emphasizing different aspects of their views on the NSA. I mean, the elite conversation on surveillance and the NSA surveillance has changed, right? And that elite conversation may be enough. I mean, there was a Daily Beast article, and Eli linked to it this morning, and I can't remember who it was, but saying that next year is really going to be where the political fights over all this are coming out. Do you think that sort of the shift in the elite consensus over NSA surveillance, and by elite I'm including not just Congress, but also government workers, journalists, everyone, that's going to have some sort of policy change?
No, I think that does play a role, plays a big role. But it's only one thing. I mean, that changes the conversation, but when the rubber meets the road for electeds is, do I play a political cost for doing this or not doing this?
Right.
And it's unclear to me yet that those costs have been made apparent in any significant way to Congress.
Right.
I mean, I think if we look at the Syria question, clearly, voters made abundantly, clear to their representatives that they did not want a military intervention in Syria. The Congress heard them loud and clear. We have not really seen anything like that on NSA stuff. And we've,
Right. Well, I mean, now that you've mentioned it, surely one of the biggest stories in foreign policy from this year has to be sort of the broad continuance of the Syrian civil war, right, and the extreme surprise. I mean, the surprises keep coming, right? At the beginning of the year, no one believes that Assad is going to survive, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I went back and revisited my predictions, and I think I predicted February 15th would be the end of Assad, and egregiously wrong. Nobody predicted, including President Obama, that
Hmm.
Syria would use chemical weapons. No one predicted how the chemical weapons threats of intervention would play out, and certainly no one predicted the Russians stepping in. So this is a huge story too, right? I mean, what do you think of the long term implications of the Syria story?
The long-term implications. Well, a couple things. One is I'm sitting here watching Syria, and
Mm-hmm.
my question now, as it always has been, I mean, what are the United States' options for making this situation better, and at what cost?
Mm-hmm.
And as difficult as it is to say this, my position remains. I mean, they are very small. Um, you watch Syria in an interesting way. I guess it's not interesting. It's tragic. It is tragic. Is Syria is going in some ways it's going through a similar thing that Iraq went through,
Mm-hmm.
where you have this insurgency, you have the inflow of foreign fighters from the region as well as from Europe. It's essentially playing out as a proxy war between Iran on the one side and Saudi and other Gulf states like Qatar supporting the Sunni insurgents on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
The key difference here is that the United States is not in the middle of it holding the bag.
Right, right.
I think that's a good thing, personally. I mean, yes, we are fielding complaints regularly from our Gulf allies and others who want to see the United States playing a bigger role. None of them, as yet, to my knowledge, has kind of mapped out how the United States could play a bigger role and make things better. The next person who really describes that process will be the first, as far as I know.
Right.
Um, So I mean, Kerry is doing. He's trying to move forward on this Geneva process. People are skeptical. I think they're right to be skeptical, but I don't see any other better options. I mean, you've always got this kind of drumbeat of much more hawkish analysts and neocons here in Washington who are like, well, if
Mm-hmm.
the United States would just use its military tool, if we would just give them bigger weapons, if we would do A, B, and C, we could use our great power to create these outcomes. Which I just don't. It's always fine to argue these things. If only we had done this 2 years ago, things would be much different, and maybe. But I think the decisions that were made 2 years ago were made for very good reasons based on information we had at the time.
Right.
And I'm very skeptical that we could have, that the situation would have been markedly better at an acceptable cost. The situation that I see as being far more likely is, yes, it would be this bad, except we'd be in the middle of it.
Right, right. I can't remember. I think it was Jamie Kirchick made some comment about how our lack of intervention in Syria has led to a refugee crisis and the rise of fascist parties in Europe, and suggesting that somehow U.S. intervention would have solved that problem, as if
Right.
as if Iraq
Well,
didn't
no, I
have a
mean
refugee
that's great. I mean,
problem.
they always recognize
Right,
the costs of non-intervention.
right.
I mean, that's part of buying your ticket to be a neocon, right? Is only recognizing the negative consequences of not doing something.
Well, I mean, a neocon is basically it's just a PR strategy, right? I mean, it's throwing
Mm-hmm.
everything against the wall and figuring out what sticks.
Mm-hmm.
In support of principles that are sort of no longer obvious even to the PR, right? It's like, it's as if Sterling Cooper was just selling itself rather than selling a product. But sort of boring down a little bit on this Syria question. I guess three thoughts I want to get from you. One, does the way that this played out reflect any sort of the way the decision in the United States played out reflect any sort of implications with respect to the balance between executive and congressional power on war making? Right? Are we seeing a return to the post Vietnam period in some sense? Two, the pushback that you mentioned earlier from the public. Is this also a long-term thing? And I think that you mentioned this a little bit in context
Mm-hmm.
of the NSA, right? The general pushing back against the national security state. And three, and you also mentioned a little bit about this, but what about the Syrian people, right? How much longer is this civil war going to continue, to your thinking?
Right. I mean, taking the last one first.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just admit I don't know. I think I can only, I can only say it's a tragedy so many times without sounding trite, but
Right,
it
right,
really
right.
is. I just don't see really good options for changing the situation beyond what we're doing to just contain it.
Right.
We can help we could work more closely with Turkey, more closely with Jordan, both on dealing with their refugee issues, working more closely on in an advisory capacity with the Free Syrian Army, although that's obviously complicated.
Right.
Given that at this date we still don't know who these people are, apparently. And as for the first two questions, I don't know. I mean, I think I forget where I read this, but someone, and this was someone in favor of the intervention, basically credited the Obama administration with this absolutely brilliant bank shot by pretending that he wanted to do something and then throwing it to Congress in order to prevent himself from having to do something.
Right.
I don't think I really buy that, but I think the impact has been, I think that moment when the President of the United States, sort of put himself on the line, said we need to do this. He and Secretary Kerry even more went out there and made this very, very strident, I would say too strident, argument for why it was necessary to do something, and then got completely, smacked down by the U.S. Congress and by the voters who were calling in huge numbers against the intervention. I don't know if it really has huge implications for the relationship between the executive and the legislative and war-making powers. It might, but I think what it does is it sort of, what I've seen happen is just it really has put hawks on their heels. They understand this as a sort of new reality in American politics, and I think that is an entirely good thing.
Right. Right. And I read accounts of the same argument, and there are elements that are plausible to the sort of the bank shot theory. Bank shot theory is almost always wrong, but there are elements of it that are plausible.
I mean, it's basically saying that Obama planned to embarrass himself,
right,
in order to achieve this larger goal. I don't find that convincing.
Right. Well, I mean, sort of in favor of the argument would be that embarrassment is going to happen no matter what. Right. That the Obama administration was farsighted enough to appreciate that there was no good outcome that could possibly emerge from the situation that was developing. Right. So it was going to be embarrassing when we lobbed a bunch of cruise missiles and Assad didn't fall. And so the administration was going to endure embarrassment in any case. I think what some of the people who were in favor and who were dismayed by Obama's action pointed out was that this will make it interesting the next time when another president seeks to use authority under the War Powers Resolution or seeks to evade the War Powers Resolution. Right? I mean, this administration has been cagier than most with respect to its compliance with the War Powers Resolution. And you can certainly read the Syria action as saying, okay, all right, the War Powers Resolution is not only constitutional, but we're going to abide by it, more or less. Yeah. Right. The Libya stuff complicates that in a lot of ways, but as a legal precedent, it is an interesting precedent, and it also lays against the hawks, people with hawkish attitudes. So it's interesting stuff. I mean, another thing that's interesting is that. Teaching here at a foreign policy school, there was essentially no one that I knew who thought it was a good idea to intervene in Syria.
Yeah.
I don't remember any of the faculty thinking it was a good idea. I don't remember any of the students thinking it was a good idea. And that's really surprising, right? It's not how it would have been a few years ago.
Yeah. I mean, moving now to something where I think it's going to take a few steps to get how I connect this to Syria, although I guess not, because we're moving to Iran, one of Syria's biggest backer. But just to get to that first, I think one way to improve Syria, actually the best way to improve Syria in the medium term, or the best possibility, would be to get some agreement with Iran. I don't see any possibility of improving the situation on Syria and ending the violence or diminishing in any real way without some cooperation from Iran. Now, it may not even work, even if we do get this nuclear agreement. But my point is that this agreement that's being hashed out right now,
Mm-hmm.
or we're actually not even in the 6-month period, which is its own kind of separate thing. Where the technical experts are talking right now. The P5+1 and Iran are engaged in talks. I guess they've broken for the new year, but they were talking yesterday about implementing the interim deal that was signed in Geneva then begin the 6-month period in which they would hash out the broader comprehensive deal. But looking at the way that the U.S.-Iran relationship has changed just in the space of the last, say, 6 months, it's really staggering.
No, it really is shocking.
I think we just need to what?
I know, it's quite surprising. And to many terrifying, right? I mean, not to me, but certainly there are people out there seem to be genuinely terrified about the direction that the relationship is going.
Right, and I think the right people are terrified by this.
Right.
But just if you look at 6 months ago, the idea we're now kind of blasé about, oh yeah, sure, the Assistant Secretary of State is sitting down with the Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister. The Secretary of State, John Kerry, is meeting the Foreign Minister of Iran. President Obama calls the President of Iran, Hassan Rouhani.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing how quickly we've sort of become acclimated to this after decades of virtual non-communication, or any communication that happened was in the form of speech making, or the occasional letter, or the occasional track two, or meetings where cakes with keys were exchanged.
Right.
But what's happening right now with Iran is, potentially era-defining. I don't want to oversell it, but I will say that it's still kind of a longish shot.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the issues at play over Iran's nuclear program, needless to say, are very complicated.
Right.
But it seems to me that it's very possible that we could have a deal. Now, the question I have is whether that deal creates some measure of trust that allows the United States and Iran to kind of move forward on other issues, whether it's terrorism, whether it's Iran's posture towards Israel, whether Iran's support for the Assad regime. My hope is yes. I mean, we've seen in recent history, talking here about the cooperation that was done around Afghanistan, is that it's possible to identify areas of mutual interest in which the United States and Iran cooperate, or at least consult deeply, which could then create the opportunity for meetings and talks and cooperation on other issues. So that process, as we know from multiple sources, one of the best being former Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who talked about the cooperation that was done about Afghanistan, and then George W. Bush decided that he was going to put Iran on the axis of evil, and that short-circuited any possibility of that right there. I think in retrospect, that was just a huge mistake. Of course, David Frum will never ever be able to admit that phrase was extremely stupid and counterproductive. I don't think there's any good argument.
It's a great turn of phrase, though. I mean, it's great speech writing, fantastic speech writing.
Man, if you're just a writer,
just give that up, right? I mean,
right.
It's very.
No, but I think that's it. Go ahead.
Okay, it's very interesting watching this process unfold. I've been reading. In fact, I've finished a book by a scholar here at Kentucky named her name is Han Nguyen, on the sort of the opening up of North Vietnamese views of the diplomatic and military process towards the end of the Vietnam War. And there's a lot about the halting, difficult struggle, diplomatic engagement, basically between 68 and 70 and 72, and a lot about triangular diplomacy. I mean, one way that book sort of gave you a little bit of insight into the Iran question, and it's one where I'm going to disagree with you with respect to Syria, was that for all the Nixon administration always wanted triangular diplomacy, always wanted good relations with the Chinese to force the North Vietnamese to do something. It always failed, right? I mean, even the end of the war basically operated almost completely by a North Vietnamese logic rather than by the Beijing or Moscow logic. And so that leaves me a little bit skeptical that even sort of changing the tone of relations with Iran is going to affect what happens in Syria. But also...
Yeah, I think that's can I just quickly respond to that? I think that's very fair to bring up. I mean, how much of a difference would you say is it? How meaningful a difference is it that we're not a party really to this civil war or this insurgency?
That's interesting. It's interesting, but what I think is that even diplomatic agreements like these, and opening is um, openings, rapprochement, whatever, however you want to
Hmm.
phrase them. You know what
Hmm.
they don't end competition. They just make certain kinds of competition appropriate,
Yeah.
and other kinds
Right.
inappropriate. And
Hmm.
I find it unlikely that we're going to be able to talk Iran out of feeling that Syria is an appropriate way to compete with Israel and the United States and Saudi Arabia. Um, I think that that's going to
Hmm.
sort of be, it's just going to be a different kind of competition, but they're going to keep carrying it out.
All right.
Um,
I mean, I'm not suggesting at all that Iran will be convinced to kind of to throw Assad under the bus in
mhm,
any way.
right.
I don't think. Yeah, I agree. Their interest and the value of that relationship will not change. What I am saying is that there's a possibility that we might be able to work out for them to play a somewhat more productive role
Right.
in the way that's going. And even that I recognize is kind of optimistic.
Right. Um, but anyway, so the other part of it that was really interesting, we were thinking about this, was just the difficulty of process, but of what process really meant. I mean, it was a struggle to get both the North Vietnamese and the Americans to the table because both of them understood that once you start talking, it's really hard to stop.
Hmm.
The talks themselves become a point of value, and
Hmm.
a point of blame that can be thrown around. And so,
Hmm.
and that's sort of what people are trying to do here, right? They're trying to
Yeah.
start a process of talking so that both sides are afraid of unilaterally stopping the talks.
Yeah.
Um, and that actually, I think, carries, potentially quite positive implications with respect to
Yeah.
the future of the U.S.-Iran relationship.
Yeah. No, I agree with that, and I would just add another point, and I've heard this from administration sources, is that I mean just the value of just sitting down with the Iranians
Mm-hmm.
over the past, it's happened over the past few years, but it's been much more intense over the past few months. The value of just sitting down and hearing from Iranians repeatedly how they perceive their interests and what their red lines are and what they
Mm-hmm.
can and cannot do politically has been enormously valuable
Right.
to the United States. And this in itself is just a huge refutation of the hawkish argument about, oh, well, we sit down with these people and we legitimize their rule. I mean,
Right.
that's the basic argument that the Bush administration used and others, critics of the Obama administration's engagement policy have used. Oh, well, you legitimize these regimes when you sit down and talk to them as if, sitting down and talking with the representatives of the United States is itself a reward for good behavior rather than a
Right.
tool that we use to try to produce that behavior. So essentially, these people argued that we should deny ourselves this information,
Right.
which in turn helps us make better policy. I just think that's an argument that should be made. People need to be made to understand that more, how valuable it is to sit down and understand. And even, maybe a lot of these representatives are kind of trying to, I would assume that they're trying to snow us in some ways and we're trying to snow them in some ways. But
Right.
at the very least, the way they're trying to snow us is revealing of what their real interests are.
Right. I mean, well, the baseline assumption that I think a lot of people opposed to engagement have is that we already have the best policy, right? Only we ought to do
Hmm.
more of it, right? And so,
Right.
this thing you have about better policy, better policy is more sanctions, right? Better policy is,
Hmm.
soft military action,
Right.
stepping up
Right.
military. So, and we already know this, and we don't need to know what the Iranians think about that in order to know
Yeah.
that. It's sort of their
Right.
baseline. But yeah, no, and this is one of those that we may come back in a year and say, well, heck, that didn't play out, did it? If the talks break down or whatever. But,
Hmm.
it's also potentially something very productive that will lead to some significant changes in the future.
Yeah. So let's I think is our last point here, and this relates to the Syria discussion, but I also think it relates to the Iran discussion as well. Is we talked about the massive outpouring of public opposition to the Syria intervention,
Mm-hmm.
but I think this is, I mean, it's much bigger than Syria. We saw a couple of recent polls over the past few days, including one today from CNN, that has the war in Afghanistan now as the most unpopular war in American history. 80% of Americans think it was not the right choice.
Mm-hmm.
This is higher than opposition to Vietnam, higher than opposition to Iraq ever was. I find this kind of amazing, given what a reversal this is. I mean, everyone understood how necessary it was to invade Afghanistan in October 2001.
Mhm.
And now, I guess you can chalk a lot of this up certainly to just exhaustion. Um,
Right. I
but
mean, I
but
think
but you're
there are probably two things going on. One is that the salience is probably. I mean, the number of people who know that we're
yeah,
still fighting in Afghanistan is sort of an interesting point, and that no one in the executive is willing to go to bat for Afghanistan. I mean, they
yeah,
all think it's a terrible idea that we're there right now too,
yeah,
which of course is interesting given that they escalated the war a few years ago. Um, but yeah, and it's hard for me to sort of imagine the what kind of conflict you'd have to float that would get a really positive response from the
right,
American. What can I sell you in terms of a war right now? Right, please, I want to sell you a
yeah,
war.
yeah,
Um, although at the same time you probably note that we have our military is still doing things with Mali. Our military is
hmm
still doing things in South
right,
Sudan, in the
yeah,
Central African Republic, which are all I don't know if we want to call a near genocide the Central African Republic an honorable mention, right? But um, it's certainly something that's important.
yeah.
That's going on right now in terms of foreign policy. Um,
Right, no, there's clearly we're intervening militarily in all
right.
kinds of places. So it's
Right.
not just kind of a broad opposition to military intervention, but yeah, it is this, a very, very strong opposition to putting thousands and thousands of U.S. troops on the ground. Um,
Right.
but there was a point. Oh yeah, this you mentioned the surge, the Afghanistan surge, and I'm thinking back to one of these that you and I did right after the president's speech at West Point, where he announced, they'd done the policy review and they were going to be adding some 30,000 troops in Afghanistan.
Mhm.
And the question you and I discussed was, well, what was always said about Afghanistan was that it the effort in Afghanistan got screwed because of Iraq.
Mhm.
If only we'd kept our eye on the ball in Afghanistan and not diverted all those resources and troops and attention and everything over to Iraq, we could have successfully, finished the job in Afghanistan. And your point, which I think is looking very smart in retrospect, is like, well, now we'll find out if that's really true, and it
Mhm.
appears that it may not have been really true.
Mhm. Right. I mean, there are timing questions, and there are part of the problem with Iraq is not just that it was Iraq that it drew away resources, although that was important, but also that it sort of ruined it wrecked the image of the United States in the Islamic world in the way that the Afghanistan invasion really didn't. Right. I
Yeah,
mean, I don't
yeah,
think the Islamic world didn't really view invading Afghanistan as a great idea, but it was
yeah,
at least understandable. It's not
yeah,
like straightforward U.S. military aggression against the Islamic
yeah,
world, which is what the Iraq really was understood. Um,
yeah,
and the Iraq then sort of poisons Afghanistan. So, it will
yeah,
be. I will be fascinated. I guess I'm on record as being kind of an Afghanistan optimist in the sense that I think that the Afghan regime, that the Karzai and whoever Karzai's successor is, that state is going to hold on well after we leave and is going to survive in some form well after we leave. There are obviously a
hmm
lot of people who disagree with that point, and a lot of people in Afghanistan who disagree with that point. So
hmm
we'll see how it ends up. But the salience issue is also really interesting to me, right? Because yes, Afghanistan is less popular than Vietnam was, but almost no one cares, right? Everybody cared about Vietnam when it was really unpopular, but
yeah,
nobody is willing to go out and demonstrate again. Not, I mean, not nobody,
yeah,
but very few people are willing to
right,
demonstrate. Nobody in Congress really cares about it. Um, it's the war that nobody likes, but nobody really is interested enough to make
yeah,
sure that it doesn't continue. And it seems like the dynamics of it ending are entirely going to be diplomatic dynamics, right? They're
yeah,
entirely going to be in
yeah.
terms of the conflict between Afghan authorities and American authorities rather than driven by U.S. political dynamics.
So I mean, getting back to the broader question of
Mm-hmm.
U.S. public posture toward interventions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my question is, how long does this last? How long do we go through this period before we sort of forget and we sort of romanticize the idea of America going to war? Does that happen? I mean, we had the Vietnam experience,
Right.
and then we had Gulf War One, where you had George H.W. Bush and those around him saying, "Oh, we finally kicked the Vietnam syndrome."
Mm-hmm.
And America slowly started to acclimate itself again to bigger interventions, even though Somalia went poorly. But then we had Kosovo, we had. Um, but one of the things that I've always, one of my favorite articles about the 9/11 era was written. It was shortly after the Iraq invasion, I think. It was by Chris Hayes, where he wrote about the 90s, how we basically spent a decade of 50th anniversaries of World War II,
Right.
just kind of remembering fondly this great war and what a heroic effort was, and it was heroic in so many ways. But we had Saving Private Ryan, we had Band of Brothers, we had, oh man, wasn't we had a job to do, and America stepped up to the plate, and we did the job, and we won, and we defeated evil. So we basically spent the previous decade just sort of priming ourselves, putting ourselves in this mindset that if evil comes up, we need to defeat it. And then 9/11 happened, and we were sort of like, as a country, mentally ready
Right.
to go back at it. We'd just completely forgotten the ugliness of it. And we needed another 10 years to remind ourselves that, war is a really dirty, awful business.
It's interesting you bring up sort of the historical comparison because, we're still sort of in the midst of and although this doesn't play out in the foreign policy way, but we're still in the midst of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. But in terms of, we are going to start reliving the 50 years ago in Vietnam very soon, right?
Mm.
There's going to be a lot of interesting stuff coming out, a lot of discussions, and it'll be interesting how that filters into sort of our post-hoc interpretations of Vietnam. We're also coming up, interestingly enough, on the 100th anniversary of World War One, and that's
Right.
probably discussions that should happen, but World War One doesn't exist in our historical memory, in our popular memory in any sense.
Right, which is always really interesting to me.
Right.
I mean, it's understandable, but it is. I mean, I was just briefly. I was over in Brussels at the EU Parliament a couple months ago,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone wearing the red poppies,
Right.
and it was yet another reminder of how completely present it is in the European mindset when they in their historical memory, and it just simply does not exist here in the United States.
Right. Right. But I suspect that Vietnam is going to exist, and you may have.
Yeah, definitely.
You may have sort of a process that is similar to, but the opposite of that '90s process, right? Where we can watch in 50 years ago Technicolor as this becomes more and more disastrous, and we can then sort of do an interpretation of Vietnam and Afghanistan in those terms.
Yeah, right. Interesting.
Well, I just wanted to mention one briefly. I don't know if we'll call this the hazy part between the honorable mention and the actual things we're talking about. I think the sort of steady ratcheting up of tensions in East Asia, and we've done a few blogging heads about these over this year, the steady ratcheting up of tensions between South Korea and Japan and China and Vietnam, the Philippines, is really, it's a slow story, it's a slow developing story, but I think it's a story that's going to, basically structure our relationship with East Asia for the next decade, is how these countries really sort through what are, in many cases, frankly ridiculous disputes. But how those disputes play out against their own sort of very rich histories of conflict with one another. And so 2013 has been very interesting to watch in that context.
Yeah. So I just wanted to, we got to finish up here soon, but just to briefly come back to the GOP foreign policy fight. Which is kind of a subcategory of the broader U.S. disenchantment with military interventions. We saw a couple of things. One we saw earlier this year at the Heritage Foundation was Rand Paul's big foreign policy speech, where he basically took back Reagan, or tried to take back Reagan from the neoconservatives. Came out vocally in favor of containment of Iran, which I found really interesting, even though that's not been a regular feature of his speeches since then. And another thing that again, I didn't see people covering it as much was Marco Rubio's speech at the American Enterprise Institute a few weeks ago. Now, the American Enterprise Institute, as people know, I mean, this is like the neocon mothership.
Right.
This is where the quote unquote serious neoconservative policy gets done.
Right.
And he gave this speech where he essentially triangulated away from neoconservatives on the one hand and isolationists on the other. He didn't use those. Well, he used the term isolationist, but he said interventionism and isolationism. And he was saying neither of these things. Let's find a place in the middle, which I found really, really interesting. Even if the substance of his policy was still basically just interventionist neoconservatism, the fact that he recognizes that it's politically necessary to distance himself from this commitment to the magical powers of military intervention is very, very telling to me.
Right. It's really fascinating, and you and I have talked a lot about this, but it's not shocking in some ways that this shift is happening, especially given the unpopularity of the interventions. But just as long ago as the Mitt Romney for President campaign of 2012, it really still seemed like the neocons had all the cards, right? I mean, it really still felt like they had the levers in, not in terms of actually, managing American foreign policy, but in managing the GOP's approach to foreign policy.
Right.
That they were still sort of the people you had to pass through in order to make it into a Republican campaign and to make Republican talking points. And that seems to have changed very quickly, right? That has shifted very quickly, and I'm kind of curious how this is playing out in congressmen's offices and senators' offices, right? I mean, are the heritage interns still producing what are the talking points they're looking like now producing, or what that they're producing now looking like? And it seems to have been a very interesting shift, and very quick, very fast.
Yeah, I wonder, though. I mean, I agree that as far as the public debate, it has really shifted. But my question is, okay, in terms of the actual organizations producing policy, it doesn't really... I'm having a hard time identifying. I mean, of course, Cato does good work. They're offering an alternative. But the commanding heights of policymaking still seem to be very much in the hands of the neoconservatives.
Right.
So yeah, it's hard to identify, even though you have people like Rand Paul, even though what I said about Rubio, him triangulating away from neoconservatism, those are important signs. It's I'm trying, like, who, and I think you and I have covered this before, in the event of, someone like Rand Paul winning the presidency, who staffs his administration?
Right.
Where do you go to get these non-neoconservatives to fill all these spots? Before we finish up, I know you need to go. I do want to address one question. It's that I've recently received some pushback on my, as I have here on my preference for a martini with both olive and lemon twist. Where do you stand on this question?
Well, I'm going to answer this question in two ways. One, I'm really a big fan of the Gibson, so that's a way to avoid the whole question. Is just put onions in your martini.
Okay.
Second, I have nothing against the lemon twist. I have no problem with it. But when I'm selling martinis myself, I don't go to the trouble. I just go with olives. So the home Farley martini, which actually sounds really good for this afternoon, doesn't it? And it's New Year's Eve, so I might as well drink like 5 of them. So yeah, that's how I do it. When I'm at your house, I'm happy to drink the lemon twist, but when it Casa de Farley, with the Farley compound, it's just olives.
Okay. Bring my own lemon twist is what you're saying.
That's what I'm saying.
Next time I drink at your house. I mean, my own justification is that I came up with this on the fly the other day when someone challenged me on it, but I'm going to stick to it now. Is that my own? I really love Mediterranean cuisine, and there's a lot of lemon and olive in there.
That's true.
So those flavors go well together, and that's my story, and I'm going to stick to it.
Okay,
so Happy New Year. Happy New Year, everyone. Thanks for watching Foreign Entanglements. Follow us. You can check us out on Facebook. Rob, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, Matt.